On December 6, 1917, a man named Vince Coleman sat at a telegraph key in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and typed what he believed would be his last message on Earth. An ammunition ship was on fire in the harbor. The explosion was minutes away. Every rational instinct he had was telling him to run. He stayed. He sent the warning. He saved hundreds of lives. And then the Canadian government spent the next several years trying to make absolutely certain that nobody ever asked why he had to make that choice in the first place. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. What happened in Halifax on that December morning is one of the most devastating events in the entire history of North America. Before the atomic bomb was ever conceived, before any weapon of mass destruction had ever been deliberately detonated, a single harbor in a single Canadian city produced the largest man-made explosion the world had ever seen. Nearly 2,000 people died, 9,000 were injured, 25,000 were left without adequate shelter in the middle of a Canadian winter. An entire neighborhood was vaporized, hundreds of children were permanently blinded, and the city of Halifax was, in the truest sense of the phrase, destroyed in seconds. But this story is not simply about an explosion. Explosions happen, accidents happen. What sets the Halifax disaster apart from every other industrial catastrophe of its era is what came immediately after. The investigations, the trials, the political maneuvers, the quiet, careful process by which an enormous systemic failure, and years in the making, was repackaged as the fault of two specific men who happened to be French. And then, when those two men were ultimately acquitted, and the courts essentially admitted the whole thing was a rush to judgment, the government simply moved on. No accountability, no reform, no honest reckoning with the choices that turned a busy harbor into a killing field. This is the story the history books summarize in 2 paragraphs. The explosion was big. Many people died. A relief train came from Boston. The end. But the real story is far longer and far darker than that. It requires going back to the beginning, back to 1917, to a city that had no idea what was coming, and to a chain of decisions made by men in authority who absolutely should have known better. To understand what Halifax was in December of 1917, you need to understand what the First World War had done to the city. Halifax, Nova Scotia, sits on one of the finest natural harbors on the Atlantic coast of North America. The harbor is deep, wide, sheltered from the open ocean by a peninsula and a series of protective headlands, and positioned almost perfectly for transatlantic crossings. In the peacetime years before the war, Halifax had been a significant but not exceptional port city, a place of maybe 50,000 people, a naval base, a center for the Atlantic fishing trade, a railway terminus, an important but unglamorous outpost of the British Empire sitting on the eastern edge of Canada, staring out at the cold, gray North Atlantic. The war changed everything. But from the moment Britain declared war on Germany in August of 1914, and Canada automatically followed as a dominion of the British Empire, Halifax became one of the most strategically vital ports in the entire Allied war effort. Every convoy of soldiers and supplies crossing from North America to Europe passed through or near Halifax. The harbor became a staging ground for troop ships, supply vessels, ammunition transports, and the warships that escorted them. The city's population swelled by perhaps a third in the wartime years, as workers, soldiers, sailors, and the families who followed them poured into a city that had not been built to hold them all. Boarding houses ran at capacity. New neighborhoods expanded rapidly. The economy was booming in the particular way that wartime economies boom, with money moving fast and no one stopping to ask whether the foundations being built were sound. The docks ran 24 hours a day. The harbor was, by 1917, operating at a level of activity it had never seen before and was arguably not designed to handle at that pace. In the 18 months between January 1916 and June 1917 alone, the number of ships passing through Halifax Harbor had increased by more than 40%. There were days when Bedford Basin, the large body of water connected to Halifax Harbor by the Narrows, held more than 80 ships waiting for convoy assignment. The piers along the Halifax waterfront were in constant use. The railway yards that connected the harbor to the rest of Canada ran trains day and night. The whole apparatus of the Atlantic war effort was operating through this one city, and the infrastructure straining to keep up with the demand had been built for a peacetime port, not a wartime industrial node. The people who managed the system were not incompetent. They were overwhelmed. There is a difference, and it matters for understanding what happened. The officers of the Royal Canadian Navy who administered Halifax Harbor were working within a system that was under-resourced for what it was being asked to do, and the pressure from above was consistently in the direction of more throughput, faster processing, fewer delays. The Admiralty in London, the Canadian Naval Command, the convoy system administrators, all of them applied downward pressure on the harbor authorities to keep ships moving. Every hour a ship sat idle in Halifax Harbor was an hour of war production lost. In every delay in the convoy schedule was a delay in getting supplies to the front. The men who ran the harbor knew this. They felt it, and they responded to it in the way that overwhelmed administrators always respond, by cutting corners on the things that seem least urgent in the immediate moment. The Richmond neighborhood, which sat on the northern tip of the Halifax Peninsula overlooking the Narrows, the narrow strait connecting Halifax Harbor to the wider Bedford Basin, had grown particularly dense with families connected to the war economy. Working-class families, dock workers, railway employees, mechanics and tradespeople who kept the war machinery running. Their homes were modest wooden houses packed tightly together on streets that sloped down to the water. Many of the houses in Richmond were old, built in the decades after Confederation, wood-framed in the style of the era, with windows that looked out toward the harbor. The neighborhood had a particular character, a working waterfront community that had grown up in the shadow of the naval base, accustomed to the sounds and rhythms of the harbor, to the smell of salt water and engine oil, to the sight of ships moving through the Narrows at all hours. The Richmond district was not wealthy. It was not prominent. It did not have political influence. It was a neighborhood of ordinary people doing ordinary work in the service of an extraordinary historical moment, and it was directly in the path of what was coming. By 1917, the movement of explosives through Halifax Harbor was not unusual. It was routine. The Allied war effort consumed munitions at a staggering rate. The Western Front alone burned through artillery shells at a pace that strained the productive capacity of every Allied nation. Britain and France were manufacturing explosives around the clock and still not keeping up with demand. The United States had entered the war in April of 1917 and brought its enormous industrial capacity to the Allied cause. But the production ramp-up took time, and in the interim, every available explosives factory in North America was running at full capacity. To feed the front, ships loaded with munitions and explosive materials crossed the Atlantic constantly. Many of them passed through Halifax, staging in Bedford Basin before joining transatlantic convoys, or stopping to refuel and resupply before continuing their journeys. In a single month in the fall of 1917, it was estimated that more than 40 ships carrying explosive materials of one kind or another had passed through Halifax Harbor. Ammunition ships, gunpowder carriers, vessels loaded with artillery shells, with fuse assemblies, with the industrial chemicals that went into the manufacture of explosives. They came through in a steady stream, and the harbor absorbed them, processed them, cleared them into convoys, and moved them on. The people who managed Halifax Harbor in 1917 were not ignorant of the potential danger this represented. They understood, at least in the abstract, that having large quantities of high explosives in close proximity to a densely populated civilian area carried risk. There were protocols in place. Ships carrying dangerous cargo were supposed to be identified, their movement tracked, certain precautions observed. But in the frantic operational tempo of 1917, with ships moving through the harbor every day, with the pressure of the war effort demanding speed and efficiency above all else, those protocols had become something closer to suggestions. The system that should have been managing the danger had grown complacent, and complacency in a harbor full of explosives is a form of negligence that will eventually be indistinguishable from intent. Now we need to talk about two ships, because the explosion that destroyed Halifax was not caused by a single vessel or a single event. It was caused by the intersection of two ships at a specific point in the Narrows on a specific morning, and understanding who those ships were and what they were carrying is essential to understanding everything that followed. The first ship was the SS Mont Blanc. She was a French cargo vessel, 320 feet long, built in 1899 in Middlesbrough, England, and already showing her age by 1917. She was not a new ship or a remarkable ship. She had spent nearly 2 decades moving cargo between European and Atlantic ports. She was the kind of vessel that existed in large numbers in the wartime Atlantic, a working freighter whose peacetime value lay in her carrying capacity and whose wartime value lay in her availability. Her captain was Aimé Lemaitre, a 48-year-old Breton from the town of Crozon on the western coast of France. Lemaitre had been a merchant mariner his entire adult life. He had earned his captain's papers through years of practical experience. He was experienced. He was competent. By the accounts of those who had sailed with him, he was a careful officer who took his responsibilities seriously and ran a disciplined ship. But the Mont Blanc was, by the time she arrived in Halifax, carrying a cargo that had made her one of the most lethal objects in the Western Hemisphere. Understanding that cargo requires some context about where it came from and how it got onto the ship, the Mont Blanc had loaded her cargo in New York Harbor at the Gravesend Bay, anchorage off Brooklyn, in late November of 1917. The loading process took several days and was supervised by representatives of the French government, the French Powder Commission, which was responsible for sourcing and transporting munitions for the French military. The cargo manifest was not a secret to the authorities involved. The Gravesend Bay anchorage was a designated area for munitions loading, one of the few places in New York Harbor where this kind of work was permitted. In her holds, the Mont Blanc carried 2,300 tons of wet picric acid. Picric acid, also known as melinite or lyddite in its explosive form, was one of the primary explosives used in artillery shells during the First World War. In its wet form, it was less sensitive to shock than dry picric acid, but it was still highly explosive and highly toxic. 2,300 tons of it represented enough explosive material to devastate a small city. She also carried 200 tons of TNT, trinitrotoluene, which in 1917 was coming into widespread use as a military explosive because it was more stable than picric acid and could be melted and poured into shell casings with relative ease. 10 tons of gun cotton, a highly sensitive explosive made from nitrocellulose, completed the primary explosive cargo in her holds. And on her deck, in metal drums stacked and lashed wherever they could be secured, she carried 35 tons of benzol. Benzol is a highly flammable hydrocarbon, similar in its basic properties to gasoline. It was used as aviation fuel for the aircraft that the French military was operating on the Western Front. Its flash point, the temperature at which it will ignite, is extremely low. On a cold December morning in Halifax, spilling benzol across a metal deck was essentially the same as spilling lighter fluid across a concrete floor. The slightest spark was enough. The total weight of explosive material aboard the Mont Blanc was approximately 3,000 tons. To put that number in some kind of context, consider that a single large artillery shell contains perhaps a kilogram of explosive material and can destroy a building. 3,000 tons is 3 million kilograms. The Mont Blanc was, in the most literal sense, a floating bomb of unprecedented scale. There is a detail about the Mont Blanc's appearance that matters enormously to what came later. She was carrying this cargo with no external markings to indicate she was a munition ship. No red warning flags flew from her masts. She had none of the special markings that would, under normal circumstances, identify a vessel carrying dangerous cargo. She looked, from the outside, like any other working freighter moving through the harbor on a winter morning. The reason for this was, in its wartime context, entirely logical. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, and a ship clearly marked as carrying explosives was among the most attractive possible targets. A munition ship clearly identified as such was practically an invitation to every U-boat within range to close and fire a torpedo. Allied munition ships traveled without their cargo identifications precisely because identification meant death. The military logic was sound. The civilian safety implications were, as December 6th would demonstrate, catastrophic. The second ship was the SS Imo. She was a Norwegian vessel, larger than the Mont Blanc at just over 400 feet in length, and she had a history that was, in its way, as interesting as the Mont Blanc's. She had originally been built as the passenger liner Runic, a White Star Line vessel that had plied the Liverpool to South American route before the war. When the White Star Line no longer needed her, she was sold to Norwegian interests and converted to cargo use. By 1917, she had been chartered by the Commission for Relief in Belgium, an international humanitarian organization working to supply food and essential goods to the civilian population of German-occupied Belgium. The Commission's work was genuinely important. The Belgian civilian population under German occupation was suffering from severe food shortages, and the Commission ships were among the primary means by which relief reached them. The Imo's captain was Håkon From, a Norwegian merchant officer. Her harbor pilot, the local expert who was supposed to guide her through the waters of Halifax Harbor, was a man named William Hayes, one of the most experienced harbor pilots in Halifax. Hayes had been guiding ships through the Narrows for years. He knew these waters as well as any person alive. In December of 1917, the Imo was traveling without any cargo. She had discharged whatever she was carrying and was now empty, heading to pick up a new cargo of relief supplies. Riding in ballast water only, without the weight of cargo in her holds, she sat high in the water. High-riding ships are less maneuverable than fully loaded ships, and they are affected more by currents and crosswinds. It is a detail that would matter in the Narrows on the morning of December 6th. The Imo had been supposed to leave Halifax on December 5th. She had arrived in Bedford Basin several days earlier and was waiting to take on coal before departing. The coal she needed came from a collier that was slow to deliver it, a routine administrative delay, one of those small frictions of logistics that in most circumstances leads to nothing more than minor inconvenience and a slightly altered schedule. In this case, it was one of the links in the chain that ended with nearly 2,000 people dead. Because the Imo was still in Halifax on the night of December 5th, she was still in Halifax on the morning of December 6th. When she finally began moving through the Narrows toward the open harbor, she was running behind schedule. This made the people on her bridge impatient, and impatience in the Narrows was a quality the harbor could not afford. Now, before we get to December 6th itself, we need to spend some time on December 5th, because the night before the explosion is where some of the most damning evidence of systemic failure begins to accumulate. We at Halifax Harbor had a traffic management system. Ships entering and leaving the harbor were supposed to pass through an examination zone near the harbor entrance, where an examination vessel would check their credentials, assess their cargo, and authorize their entry or departure. This was, among other things, a security measure designed to prevent German naval vessels or saboteurs from entering the harbor. But it was also, in theory, a mechanism for keeping track of what was in the harbor at any given moment, including what explosives were moving through. The Examination Vessel Authority in Halifax Harbor in December of 1917 was based around the HMCS Niobe, an aging cruiser that had been repurposed as a depot and administrative vessel working alongside a small motorboat examination vessel. The Niobe was the administrative heart of the harbor examination process. Her officers were responsible for authorizing the movement of vessels in and out of the harbor and for maintaining records of what was where. The system they were running was under enormous strain. The volume of shipping moving through Halifax Harbor was greater than anything the examination process had been designed to handle. Clearing 40 or 50 ships in a day, any one of which might require careful inspection, was simply beyond the capacity of the personnel and equipment available. The examination process had, of necessity, become abbreviated. Ships were asked questions rather than inspected. Manifests were reviewed rather than verified. The presumption of legitimacy had replaced the verification of it. And there was another problem with the examination system, and this one was structural rather than simply a product of being overwhelmed by volume. The system for tracking hazardous cargo within the harbor was decentralized to the point of being nearly useless. When the Mont Blanc had passed through the examination zone and her dangerous cargo had been noted by the harbor authorities, that information did not automatically propagate to the harbor pilot who would guide her, or to the captain of any other ship she might encounter, or to the fire service that might one day be called to respond to an emergency on her deck, or to the residents of the neighborhood she would anchor near. The information existed at the point of examination. It simply did not travel from there to the people who needed it. Now, when the Mont Blanc entered Halifax Harbor on December 5th and anchored overnight before proceeding to join a convoy the next morning, the proper notifications were made through the channels that existed. Captain Lemedic had done what was required of him under the system as it operated. He had reported his cargo to the naval authorities. The harbor pilot, Francis Mackey, had been assigned to guide the Mont Blanc through the Narrows the following morning. Everything was, on the surface, proceeding according to the available protocols. But here is what was not happening. The information about the Mont Blanc's cargo, the fact that a ship loaded with 3,000 tons of high explosives was anchored in the inner harbor within range of a densely populated civilian neighborhood, was not being transmitted to the civilians who lived in that neighborhood. No warnings were issued. No precautionary measures were suggested. No one in authority thought to inform the residents of Richmond that they were sleeping within blast range of the largest floating bomb ever assembled. The information existed. It was in the harbor authorities' possession. It simply never traveled to the people for whom it was most urgently relevant. There was a reason for this. Two reasons, actually. The first was the wartime culture of secrecy. You didn't publicize the movements of munition ships because the enemy might be listening. The second was something more uncomfortable. If you started warning civilian populations every time an explosives-laden ship passed through your harbor, you'd be warning them constantly. The movement of munitions through Halifax was so routine by 1917 that treating it as an emergency requiring public notification would have been, in the eyes of the harbor authorities, an overreaction. A disruption of normal operations that the war effort couldn't absorb. So the people of Richmond went to bed on the night of December 5th without knowing what was anchored in their harbor. Their children fell asleep. Their windows faced the water. And in the early hours of December 6th, as Halifax was locked in the gray, cold darkness of a maritime December morning, both the Mont Blanc and the Imo were preparing to move. The morning of December 6th, 1917, began the way mornings in Halifax always began in winter. Cold, gray, the harbor mist sitting low over the water, the sky the color of pewter, the kind of morning that made the city feel insulated from the rest of the world. The temperature was just below freezing. There was no wind to speak of. The water in the Narrows was calm, almost mirror flat in the early morning light. To anyone looking out at it, it was an ordinary harbor on an ordinary December morning. The Narrows, the strait that connects Halifax Harbor to Bedford Basin, is roughly a kilometer wide at its broadest point and narrower in places. It is deep enough for large vessels, but it is not the kind of open water where ships have room to maneuver freely. Ships moving through the Narrows were required to follow established lanes, keeping to one side or the other depending on the direction of their travel, and they were expected to proceed at a moderate pace. The channel was not built for speed. It was built for careful, deliberate navigation by vessels that understood they were in close quarters. At approximately 8 in the morning, the Mont Blanc began to move. Francis Mackey, the Halifax harbor pilot assigned to guide her, was on the bridge with Captain Lemedic. Mackey was an experienced pilot. He had been navigating these waters for years. He knew the Narrows, knew its currents, knew its traffic patterns, knew the rules that governed movement through its relatively confined channel. The protocol was straightforward. Ships passing through the channel going toward the harbor kept to the Dartmouth side. Ships going toward Bedford Basin kept to the Halifax side. 2 lanes, simple traffic management for a narrow strait. In theory, the Mont Blanc was loaded and low in the water, heavy with her explosive cargo. She moved carefully, as heavily loaded ships do. Mackey and Lemedic on the bridge could see the Narrows clearly in the morning light, could see the Dartmouth shore to their left and the Halifax shore to their right, could see the other vessels in the harbor going about their morning business. It was a normal harbor morning. Nothing in the early minutes of the passage gave them reason to expect what was coming. The Imo began moving at roughly the same time, coming out of Bedford Basin and heading south through the Narrows toward the harbor entrance. Captain Fromm and pilot William Hayes were on her bridge. She was empty, riding high in the water, and several witnesses would later testify that she appeared to be moving at a speed that was above what the Narrows normally warranted. The Imo was behind schedule after her delayed departure the previous day. There was pressure to make up the time. Ships behind schedule in wartime were ships that might miss their convoy windows, which in turn meant more delays, more disruption, more cost. The people on the Imo's bridge that morning were not cavalier about safety. They were working under a set of pressures that pushed them toward speed, and they gave those pressures more weight than the conditions in the Narrows demanded. What happened next in the Narrows on the morning of December 6th, 1917, has been analyzed and argued over by maritime historians for more than 100 years. The fundamental facts are not in dispute. The interpretation of those facts, specifically the question of who bore the greater responsibility for what followed, has been the subject of fierce debate from the inquiry of 1917 right up to the present day. The Imo, moving south through the Narrows, was on the wrong side of the channel. She should have been on the Halifax side, but she was closer to the Dartmouth side, the side that the Mont Blanc was properly occupying. The reason the Imo had ended up on the wrong side involves a sequence of earlier movements through the Narrows that morning, in which the Imo had been maneuvering around slower vessels and had never fully returned to her correct lane. By the time she and the Mont Blanc came within sight of each other, the Imo was in the wrong lane and moving with enough momentum that changing course cleanly was no longer a simple matter. There was an exchange of whistle signals. In the language of maritime communication, These signals were each ship communicating its intended course of action to the other. One blast meant the ship was turning to starboard, to the right. 2 blasts meant turning to port, to the left. 3 blasts meant engines reversed. The rules of the road for the harbor required specific responses to these signals, and the exchange that took place between the Mont Blanc and the IMO that morning was, when analyzed afterward, a sequence of miscommunications that each ship interpreted differently. The Mont Blanc signaled once, indicating she was turning to starboard. The IMO responded with 2 blasts, indicating she was turning to port. This was contradictory. If both ships executed their signaled intentions, they would turn into each other rather than away. More signals followed, and each ship was trying to communicate that it expected the other to give way, and neither was receiving that message. They were, in the language of the sea, talking past each other at a speed that left almost no time for the situation to be resolved before they were too close for resolution. At approximately 8:45 in the morning, the bow of the SS IMO struck the bow of the SS Mont Blanc. The impact was not, in the initial moment, catastrophic. It was a glancing blow, the bow of the IMO scraping along the forward port side of the Mont Blanc, the kind of collision that in ordinary circumstances would have meant damage, repairs, professional embarrassment, and a great deal of paperwork. The Mont Blanc's hull was breached near her bow, but the breach was not immediately life-threatening to the ship, and there was no flooding that would have sunk her quickly. No one was injured by the collision itself. The 2 ships scraped against each other with the force of 2 large vessels and then began to separate. What the collision did, with the terrible precision of accident, was scrape open the metal drums of benzol lashed to the Mont Blanc's forward deck. The scraping of the IMO's steel bow against the Mont Blanc's steel hull and the steel drums produced sparks. The spilling benzol, instantly volatile in the cold air, ignited. The Mont Blanc was on fire. Within seconds of the collision, the benzol burning on the Mont Blanc's forward deck was throwing flames high enough to be visible from the Halifax waterfront. The fire was spectacular even from a distance, burning with the intense orange and black of a petroleum fire, sending a column of black smoke up into the morning sky. To anyone watching from the shore, it was the kind of thing that made you stop and stare. A ship on fire in the harbor, dramatic, dangerous looking, something to watch. Now, what the crew of the Mont Blanc did next has been the subject of more controversy than almost any other aspect of this story, and understanding their actions requires understanding exactly what they knew that nobody watching from the shore could possibly have understood. Captain Lemedic knew what was in his ship's holds. His crew knew what was in his ship's holds. They were standing on a vessel that was, at that moment, on fire, and directly beneath the fire, in the holds below, were 2,300 tons of picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, and 10 tons of gun cotton. They knew, with complete certainty, that if the fire reached the holds, the explosion that followed would be unsurvivable. Not just for the crew of the Mont Blanc, for anyone within range. Lemedic made a decision. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. He ordered the lifeboats lowered. Every man who could reach a boat got into it. They rowed for the Dartmouth shore as hard as they could, as many of them as possible, the oars working hard against the calm water of the Narrows, the burning ship receding behind them. Some of the crew who could not reach the boats jumped into the freezing water and swam. This decision, the abandonment of the burning ship in the Narrows, would later be weaponized against Lemedic and Mackey in the most cynical way imaginable. The argument would be made in the inquiry and in the public discourse that followed, that by abandoning the ship without attempting to fight the fire, or without making greater efforts to warn the population, they had contributed to the destruction of Halifax. That argument collapses under the weight of its own logic. A crew fighting a fire on a ship loaded with 3,000 tons of high explosives would have died in the explosion just as surely as if they had given up. Probably sooner and at closer range, there was no possible intervention that would have stopped what was already in motion. The only variable that could be affected by human decision in those minutes was whether the men on the Mont Blanc lived or died. As the Mont Blanc's crew rowed desperately for shore, they were shouting warnings. They were screaming in French at anyone they could see on the Halifax waterfront to run, to get away, to get as far back from the water as possible. But the language barrier was absolute. The dock workers and curious onlookers who were beginning to gather along the waterfront were English-speaking. The French sailors shouting and gesturing wildly from their lifeboats were incomprehensible to them. People later described seeing the French sailors and thinking they were in distress about the collision or upset about the fire on their ship, without understanding that what they were actually communicating was a matter of life and death for everyone within sight. There is a bitter irony in this. The crew of the Mont Blanc had done, under the circumstances, everything they could reasonably do. They could not stay on the ship. They could not fight the fire. They could not speak English well enough to communicate the danger clearly. The one thing they might have been able to do, signal an official warning through the maritime communication system, was no longer possible because they had abandoned the ship, and the people they were trying to warn, the people gathering on the waterfront to watch the spectacular fire, were about to become casualties of the very explosion. The French sailors were desperately trying to tell them was coming. What was happening on the Halifax waterfront during those 20 minutes between the collision and the explosion is one of the most heartbreaking details of the entire disaster. The burning Mont Blanc had drifted from the collision site and was now moving toward Pier 6, the largest pier on the Halifax waterfront, pushed by the tide and current. The fire on her deck was growing larger and more visible with every passing minute, and the people of Halifax were watching. Halifax in 1917 was a port city. It dealt with ships every day. It was accustomed to the sounds and drama of harbor activity, and a ship on fire in the harbor was unusual but not unprecedented. It was, frankly, fascinating. People came to their windows. They went out onto their front steps. The teachers at the schools in Richmond, good people doing what seemed like the natural and educational thing, brought their students to the windows to watch. Workers on the dock stopped working and gathered along the waterfront. A streetcar running through the area slowed and stopped, and its passengers stepped off to look. A group of sailors from the American ship USS Old Colony were among those who went to the waterfront to watch. Railroad workers at the nearby rail yards had a clear view from their positions. The crowd that assembled along the Halifax waterfront to watch the burning ship on the morning of this December 6th numbered in the hundreds, possibly more than 1,000 people, most of them in positions that would put them directly within the blast zone. The fire service was responding. Halifax Fire Department had received the alarm, and the Patricia, the city's brand new motorized fire engine, pride of the city's equipment fleet, was dispatched to Pier 6. Captain William Brunt and his crew of firefighters drove through the streets of the Richmond neighborhood toward the waterfront, the engine moving as fast as the streets allowed. They had no idea what was in the ship. Nobody had told them. They were firefighters responding to what appeared to be a serious fire at a pier, doing exactly and precisely what they were trained and paid to do. Their bravery was real. Their ignorance of the specific nature of the fire was a product of the same information failure that would kill nearly 2,000 other people that morning. The Patricia reached the waterfront and stopped. The crew dismounted and began running their hoses toward Pier 6. They were connecting the first hoses to the fire hydrants when the explosion came. The entire crew was killed. The Patricia herself was destroyed. The hoses they had laid out, still connected to the hydrants, remained in the street after the explosion, running to a pier that no longer existed. a silent record of what had been happening in the seconds before the world changed. There were other emergency responders converging on Pier 6 that morning. A second fire company was en route. Harbor officials in small boats had moved toward the burning ship to assess the situation and decide whether it needed to be towed clear of the pier. The HMCS Niobe, the naval depot ship anchored in the harbor, had dispatched a small boat with sailors to assist. Several of these people, both the official responders and the members of the public who had come close out of curiosity or a desire to help, died in the explosion or from injuries sustained in it. The naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Tom Triggs, had gone to Pier 6 in an official capacity, representing the Naval Command and attempting to assess what needed to be done about the burning ship. He was killed in the explosion. His death removed from the immediate aftermath one of the people who might have been best positioned to organize an early authoritative response. The loss of experienced officers in the first seconds of the disaster compounded the disorganization that followed, because the people who would normally have provided leadership were, in many cases, casualties themselves. The response from ordinary Halifax residents in those first minutes was extraordinary in its immediacy and its disorganization. People who had been knocked down by the blast wave, who were themselves bleeding from glass cuts or dazed from the concussion of the pressure wave, began trying to help others before they had fully processed what had happened to them. Neighbors dug their neighbors out of collapsed doorways with bare hands. Strangers carried strangers toward open ground, away from burning buildings, away from the continuing collapse of structures weakened by the blast. Horses, many of them injured by flying debris, ran loose through the streets of Richmond, adding another dimension of chaos to the scene. Cart horses and carriage horses that had been hitched outside businesses or in stables when the blast hit were now injured and panicked and running through streets blocked with rubble and filled with screaming people. Vince Coleman was at his telegraph key at the Richmond Railway Yard, just a few hundred meters from Pier 6. He was the telegraph operator for Canadian government railways, responsible for communicating train movements in and out of Halifax. He was, like everyone else that morning, aware that something was burning at the pier. The fire was visible from his position. He could see the smoke, and unlike most of the people watching, he somehow learned, in those 20 critical minutes between the collision and the explosion, what the Mont Blanc was actually carrying. The exact chain of events by which Coleman received this information has some variation in the different historical accounts. Some sources indicate that a dock worker who had received word from someone with direct knowledge of the Mont Blanc's manifest had passed the information along. Other accounts suggest a more direct communication from someone connected to the harbor authority. Whatever the specific path, at some point in those 20 minutes, Vince Coleman came to understand that the burning ship was a munitions vessel and that an explosion of catastrophic scale was imminent. And he also knew that the express passenger train from St. John, the number 10 passenger, was due to arrive at the Richmond station in minutes. The Richmond station was close enough to Pier 6 that anyone on that train, passengers, crew, station workers, would be within the kill zone of the explosion that Coleman now knew was coming. Vince Coleman could have run. He was already far enough from Pier 6 that running might have given him a chance. His colleague William Lovett urged him to leave immediately. Coleman's reply, as Lovett later recounted it, was something to the effect that he needed to stop the train first. He sat back down at his telegraph key. He sent the message that has been preserved in the records of Canadian government railways, transcribed and reprinted in histories of the disaster for over a century. Hold up the train. My ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. The train operator received the message. The train was stopped well short of the station. The passengers and crew were saved. Vince Coleman died at his key when the explosion came seconds later. He was 46 years old. He had a wife and 4 children. At 9 hours, 4 minutes, and 35 seconds in the morning, the fire on the Mont Blanc reached her holds. The explosion that followed was, at that moment in human history, the largest man-made detonation the world had ever witnessed. It would hold that distinction for 28 years, until August of 1945, when the United States detonated an atomic bomb over Hiroshima, Japan. Even the comparison between the two events involves a complexity that is worth noting. The atomic bomb over Hiroshima released far more energy in total, including thermal radiation and the nuclear effects that the Halifax explosion obviously could not produce, but the pure mechanical blast wave of the Halifax explosion, the raw physical force of the pressure wave that moved outward from the Narrows at the speed of sound, was among the most destructive events in the history of human civilization. The Mont Blanc ceased to exist as a coherent object. She was not sunk. She was not damaged. She was obliterated. The 3,000 tons of explosive material she had been carrying converted, in a fraction of a second, from stable chemical compounds into an enormous release of energy. The conversion was total. The ship, her cargo, her remaining crew members who had not made it to the lifeboats, every piece of her steel and wood and paint and rope was either vaporized, liquefied, or hurled outward at tremendous velocity. The anchor shaft of the Mont Blanc, a piece of steel weighing approximately half a ton, was found 4 kilometers from the point of explosion. The barrel of her deck cannon was found 5.5 kilometers away on the Dartmouth side of the harbor. A fragment of her hull plating, a piece of steel roughly a meter in diameter, was recovered 3 kilometers inland, embedded in the ground where it had come down after being thrown into the air. The mushroom cloud from the explosion rose to a height of approximately 3.5 kilometers. The flash of the explosion was visible from Kentville, 60 kilometers to the north. The pressure wave from the explosion moved outward at the speed of sound, approximately 340 meters per second. In the first fraction of a second, it demolished every structure within the immediate blast radius. The pier, the surrounding buildings, the warehouses and sheds that lined the Richmond waterfront. In the next few seconds, it traveled outward through the Richmond neighborhood, shattering windows, collapsing roofs, tearing apart wooden frame houses as if they were made of paper. The pressure differential created by the wave was enough to cause structural failure in buildings that were not directly in the path of the blast, simply through the effect of the positive pressure wave followed immediately by the negative pressure of the vacuum that rushed in behind it. The blast wave was felt as far as 300 kilometers away. Windows were shattered in Truro, 80 kilometers to the north. In Sydney, Nova Scotia, 150 kilometers away, people reported feeling a vibration and hearing a sound like distant thunder. The force of the explosion was registered on seismographs as far away as the eastern seaboard of the United States. The Emo, the Norwegian ship that had triggered the collision, was picked up by the pressure wave and thrown across the Narrows as if she weighed nothing. She came to rest on the Dartmouth shore, her hull pushed deep into the mud, hundreds of meters from where she had been floating. Captain Frum and most of his crew survived, although several were badly injured. Pilot William Hayes, of the man who had guided the Emo on her course through the Narrows that morning, did not survive. The Dartmouth side of the harbor, which tends to receive less attention than Richmond in most accounts of the disaster, suffered its own catastrophic damage. Dartmouth in 1917 was a smaller community than Halifax, separated from it by the Narrows, but the explosion hit it with a force that was, at the waterfront, nearly as severe as what Richmond experienced across the water. The community of Tufts Cove on the Dartmouth shore, which included both working-class white families and the Mi'kmaq community at Turtle Grove, was hit directly by both the pressure wave and the tsunami that followed. Buildings along the Dartmouth waterfront were demolished. Families who had gone to their windows or stepped outside to watch the fire on the burning ship were caught in the open when the blast arrived. The response to the Dartmouth disaster was slower and less organized than the response on the Halifax side. The ferry service across the harbor, which was normally the primary means of moving between the two communities, was disrupted by the explosion. The Dartmouth ferry terminals were damaged. The ferry boats themselves were thrown about by the pressure wave and the wave that followed. For hours after the explosion, Dartmouth was effectively isolated from the larger emergency response infrastructure that was organizing on the Halifax side. Survivors in Dartmouth were, in many cases, helping each other without significant outside assistance until the disrupted communications and transit links could be re-established. The crews of the vessels that had been in the harbor at the time of the explosion found themselves in a particular situation. Several ships anchored in Bedford Basin, or moving through the harbor at the time of the blast, were damaged by the pressure wave. Their crews, many of them sailors from countries across the Allied world, found themselves in a harbor where the normal landmarks had been rearranged by the explosion, where Pier 6 was gone, where the surrounding waterfront buildings had been reduced to rubble, where the water itself was still turbulent from the tsunami wave. Some of these crews came ashore and immediately joined the rescue efforts. The sailors from the American ship USS Old Colony, who had reportedly been watching the burning ship from the waterfront when the explosion hit, included both casualties and survivors who became among the first to begin pulling victims from the rubble. The railway yards, which Vince Coleman had died to protect from the incoming passenger train, were themselves damaged. The rail lines that ran through Richmond were blocked by debris. The railway infrastructure that would shortly become critical for delivering relief supplies into Halifax and evacuating the most severely injured was, in the immediate aftermath, not fully operational. Restoring the rail connections was one of the first priorities of the organized relief effort, because without the railways, Halifax was substantially cut off from the rest of Canada. The work of clearing the lines and repairing the damaged infrastructure began within hours of the explosion, driven by the understanding that the blizzard was coming and that Halifax needed every supply corridor open before it hit. Behind the pressure wave came fire. The burning material from the Mont Blanc, ignited further by the explosion itself, fell across a wide area of the Richmond neighborhood and the waterfront. The timber construction of most Richmond houses made them easily ignitable. Buildings that had been damaged or partially demolished by the blast caught fire quickly. The Halifax graving dock caught fire. Industrial buildings along the waterfront caught fire. Within an hour of the explosion, a significant portion of the Richmond neighborhood was burning. Behind the fire came the wave. The explosion had displaced an enormous volume of water in the Narrows, creating a seismic sea wave, or tsunami, that swept up both the Halifax and Dartmouth shorelines. The wave reached as far as 500 meters inland in some places. People who had survived the blast and were near the waterfront were struck by this surge and swept away. The wave receded within minutes, but it left additional destruction in areas that had already been hit by the blast. And then came the rain of debris. The explosion had thrown an enormous quantity of material high into the air, and what went up came down. Twisted metal, shards of glass, pieces of the pier and surrounding buildings, the liquefied remains of the Mont Blanc herself, everything fell back to earth across a radius of kilometers. People who had survived the initial blast were struck by falling debris. Buildings that had withstood the pressure wave were damaged or collapsed by the impact of heavy material falling from the sky. The zone of active danger extended well beyond the immediate blast area. The people of Halifax, in those first minutes after the explosion, experienced something for which no preparation was possible. One moment there was a city, the next moment there was not. Let us talk about the dead, because they deserve more than a number. In the days and weeks after the explosion, as rescuers worked through the rubble of the Richmond neighborhood and the surrounding areas, the count of the dead climbed steadily. Final estimates have ranged from 1,700 to just over 2,000, depending on how different categories of victim are counted. Many bodies were never recovered. Some were identified only by circumstantial evidence. In certain areas of Richmond, the destruction was so complete that there was nothing left to identify. The Richmond neighborhood, the working-class community that had grown up on the northern tip of the Halifax Peninsula with its views of the Narrows, was effectively erased. The houses that had stood there that morning were gone. The streets were buried under rubble. Of the roughly 3,000 people who had been living in the densest part of Richmond, a very large proportion died in the first minutes after the explosion, and most of the survivors were seriously injured. Entire families were wiped out. On some streets, not a single resident survived. The schools were open that morning. December 6th was a Thursday, a school day, and the children of Richmond had gone to school as normal. At the moment of the explosion, many of them were in their classrooms, and many of those classrooms faced the harbor because teachers had been bringing their students to look at the burning ship. The blast wave hit those north-facing windows with full force. The children standing at the windows were the closest and most vulnerable targets. The injury that marked the Halifax explosion above almost any other disaster of its time was blindness. Hundreds of survivors, many of them children, were permanently blinded by the glass that exploded inward from those windows. In Halifax hospitals, in the days after the explosion, eye injuries were so prevalent among admitted patients that ophthalmologists from across North America were urgently requested to come to the city. There is a particular quality to mass casualty events that gets lost in the aggregate numbers. We say almost 2,000 dead, and the scale of it is intellectually comprehensible, but emotionally impossible to absorb. So let me try to give some of these deaths and injuries some of the specificity they deserve. Annie Liggins was 11 years old and lived in the Richmond neighborhood. She was at school when the explosion happened. She survived, but was permanently blinded in both eyes by window glass. She would live until 1974, spending 57 years of her life in a world of darkness caused by what a maritime accident had done to a December morning when she was 11. She was one of hundreds of children who went to school on December 6th and came home unable to see. The crew of the Patricia, the fire engine that had responded to Pier 6, were caught directly in the blast. Captain William Brunt and most of his men died at the scene or from injuries shortly thereafter. They had driven toward the fire because that was what they were trained to do. No one had told them what kind of fire it was. No one had told them that getting close to this particular fire was not bravery, but suicide. Their deaths were a direct consequence of the information failure that characterized every aspect of the harbor management system's handling of the Mont Blanc. The workers at the Acadia sugar refinery near the waterfront were at their post when the explosion hit. The refinery, a large industrial building close to the waterfront, was directly in the blast zone. Helena Duggan, 21 years old, was among those killed in the refinery's collapse. In the basement of the Richmond post office, postal workers sorting the morning mail were killed when the building above them came down. Some who had gone to the windows to look at the fire did not survive. Those who had remained at their stations in the interior had a slightly better chance, though not much. Reverend William Swetnam, the rector of St. Mark's Anglican Church in the Richmond neighborhood, was last seen running toward the explosion to help. He was never found. His parishioners, the families of the Richmond neighborhood he had served, were among the dead. And then there is the story of the Upham family. Vincent Upham had already left for work on the morning of December 6th when the explosion happened. His wife and their several children were at home. The blast hit their Richmond house directly. None of them survived. When Vincent Upham returned to his neighborhood that afternoon, fighting through the rubble and the smoke and the chaos of rescue operations, he found nothing where his house had been. His entire family had been killed while he was at work. Stories like this repeated themselves across Richmond dozens of times. Men who had left for work before 9 in the morning and came home in the afternoon to find their families dead. The explosion hit at a time of mourning when a working-class neighborhood's working adults were largely gone. The women and children who remained in the houses, those closest to the waterfront, those in the windows watching the fire, died in numbers that made the demographics of the dead brutal in their specificity. But there is one community whose losses in the Halifax explosion have been, until very recently, almost entirely absent from the mainstream historical record. On the Dartmouth side of the Narrows, in an area called Turtle Grove, there was a small Mi'kmaq community. These were indigenous families who had been living in the harbor area for generations, descendants of the people who had inhabited this part of Nova Scotia for thousands of years before European colonization. By 1917, the Turtle Grove community was economically marginal, making its living from fishing and the water-related trades that the harbor economy supported. Their homes were small and close to the water. They were, geographically, in one of the most exposed positions in the entire harbor area. The blast wave from the Mont Blanc's explosion hit the Dartmouth shore, that's where Turtle Grove was located, with full force. The tsunami wave that followed the blast swept up the Dartmouth waterfront and into the area where the Mi'kmaq community had built its homes. An unknown number of Mi'kmaq people died that morning. The historical records are imprecise to the point of being almost non-existent on this point, and the imprecision is not accidental. It reflects the degree to which the lives of Indigenous people in Canada in 1917 were considered less worth documenting than those of their white neighbors across the Narrows. The rescue and relief efforts that began in the hours after the explosion were, for the survivors of Turtle Grove, substantially less responsive and less well-resourced than what was extended to the white residents of Richmond. This was not a coincidence. It was the manifestation of the same hierarchies of worth that shaped every aspect of how the Canadian government related to Indigenous people in the early 20th century. The first hours after the explosion were chaos, of a kind that no living person in Halifax had any framework for understanding. The entire Richmond neighborhood was simultaneously on fire and buried under rubble. The streets were impassable. People who had been a kilometer away from the blast and were themselves injured were attempting to reach family members who had been closer. The hospitals were overwhelmed within minutes as casualties poured in faster than the medical staff could process them. People arrived on foot, being carried on doors and boards, in the backs of wagons, on horses. The Camp Hill Military Hospital, the Victorian Hospital, the Halifax Infirmary, every medical facility in the city was flooded simultaneously. The nature of the injuries was unlike anything the doctors and nurses had seen, even accounting for the wartime cases they had been treating throughout the previous 3 years. Burns were everywhere. Shrapnel wounds from the metal that had filled the air at the moment of the explosion were common. Crush injuries from collapsed buildings required surgical intervention that the available surgical capacity could not provide for everyone who needed it. And the eye injuries, glass embedded in corneas, glass driven through eyelids, glass that had, in some cases, passed entirely through the eye and into the skull. The number of eye injuries was so great that every available ophthalmologist in Halifax was working around the clock within hours of the explosion. And urgent requests were sent to medical centers across North America for specialists to come immediately. The triage that followed was brutal in its necessity. Those who could be helped with available resources were helped. Those whose injuries were too severe for immediate intervention were set aside, given what comfort was possible. In the days immediately following the explosion, survivors who had been relatively mobile in the first hours began dying from the effects of exposure, from delayed complications of their injuries, from the secondary effects of the collapse of normal life in the city. Outside the hospitals, the city was alternating between heroic communal action and desperate disorganization. People who had not been injured began digging through rubble with their hands, pulling out survivors from beneath collapsed buildings. Soldiers stationed in Halifax organized search operations. Sailors from the ships in the harbor came ashore to help. The stories of individual heroism from those first hours are numerous, carefully documented in the testimony of survivors who remembered being found under rubble, being carried to safety by strangers, being kept warm by people who had nothing to offer except their own body heat and the resolve not to leave someone alone in the wreckage. And then the cold. December in Halifax is serious cold. The temperature was below freezing and dropping through the day, and the thousands of people who had been left homeless, people standing in the ruins of their neighborhoods, without coats, without shelter, without food, and in many cases with serious injuries, were facing a threat that in some ways was more persistent and harder to address than the explosion itself. And then the weather got worse. On the night of December 6th and into December 7th, a massive blizzard hit Halifax. More than 40 centimeters of snow fell in less than 24 hours. The temperature dropped sharply. Roads that had been passable became impassable. The already overwhelmed rescue and relief efforts were further hampered by conditions that made outdoor work extremely dangerous. People who had been sheltering in damaged buildings were now also dealing with snow, accumulating on unstable roofs. People searching for survivors in the rubble were doing it in blinding snow and brutal cold. Supply lines between Halifax and the rest of Nova Scotia were disrupted, and the railway lines were partially blocked by snow and by the damage from the explosion. The blizzard killed people who had already survived the explosion. Injured survivors who had been placed in temporary shelters that were not adequate to the conditions died from exposure. People who had managed to keep themselves mobile in the immediate aftermath of the explosion were now immobilized by the snow and the cold. The second disaster layered itself directly on top of the first, extending the crisis and testing the city's remaining organizational capacity to its limit. The response from outside Halifax was remarkable for its speed, particularly from the United States. Boston, Massachusetts, the closest major American city with substantial medical resources, mobilized within hours of hearing news of the explosion. The Massachusetts Public Safety Committee organized what became known as the Massachusetts Halifax Relief Train, loaded with doctors, nurses, medical supplies, food, blankets, building materials, and a substantial sum of money. The train left Boston on December 6th, fighting through the leading edge of the same blizzard that was burying Halifax, and arrived in Halifax on December 7th. The timing of its arrival was critical. Halifax's own medical and relief resources were near collapse. The Boston train brought not just supplies but personnel, including ophthalmologists who were desperately needed for the hundreds of eye injury cases, and organizational capacity that the city's own disaster management structure could not provide. The gratitude of Nova Scotia for this response has never faded. Every year, since 1971, the province of Nova Scotia has sent a large Christmas tree to the city of Boston, erected on Boston Common each December. It is one of the most specific and enduring expressions of gratitude between any two communities in North American history, a ritual that began as a formal thank you and has become a tradition so deeply embedded in the cultural identity of both places that most people now accept it simply as part of December, without always knowing the exact history that produced it. Other relief came from across Canada and from Britain, but it was slower to arrive and more bureaucratically encumbered. The federal Canadian government's initial response was hampered by the same wartime focus that had created the conditions for the disaster. The military apparatus was geared toward the war in Europe, disaster relief was not its primary orientation. In the crucial first days, when the speed and quality of the response made the most difference, the most effective help came not from Ottawa, but from Boston. The Halifax Relief Commission was established in the weeks following the explosion to coordinate the distribution of aid and compensation to survivors. At its peak, the commission held more than $30 million in assets, drawn from public donations from across North America and from government allocations. It was, on paper, a well-resourced body with a clear mandate. In practice, its administration became one of the enduring sources of grievance among those it was supposed to serve. The application process for compensation required survivors to document their losses in detail. This was a challenge so fundamental as to be, for many survivors, nearly impossible. Many had lost not just their possessions, but every document they owned. Birth records, marriage certificates, property deeds, bank records, employment contracts, all of it had been in the houses that no longer existed. To rebuild a life on paper, to establish the legal basis for compensation, required documentation that simply no longer existed for many thousands of people. The Commission's response to this problem was not to relax its documentation requirements, but to demand that survivors find alternative means of proving what they had lost. This placed an enormous burden on the very people who had the least capacity to meet it. Those with social connections, those who had worked for established employers or dealt with well-documented financial institutions, had a somewhat easier time reconstructing their claims. Those without those connections, working-class families whose financial lives had been largely conducted in cash, whose property ownership was informal rather than formally registered, found the Commission's requirements effectively insurmountable. The treatment of widows was particularly problematic. Women who had lost their husbands received pensions that were means-tested and reviewed periodically. As it became clear that many widows were finding ways to support themselves, through remarriage, through work, through the support of family members, the Commission reduced or eliminated their pensions. The logic was administratively tidy. People should not receive ongoing support if they no longer needed it. The effect, experienced by the widows themselves, was that the Commission was penalizing them for resilience, for finding ways to rebuild their lives by reducing the compensation they received for the loss that had made rebuilding necessary in the first place. Now let us talk about the inquiry, because the inquiry is where the government's response to the Halifax explosion crossed from inadequate to something that looks, from a sufficient distance, like a deliberate misdirection. The pressure to establish blame was enormous and came from multiple directions simultaneously. The explosion had killed nearly 2,000 people and destroyed a significant part of a major Canadian city. The survivors were grieving and angry and needed someone to focus that anger on. The press was demanding accountability. The families of the dead needed the courts to tell them that the people responsible would face consequences. This pressure was real and was rooted in legitimate human need, but it created conditions in which the inquiry was designed, consciously or not, to provide an answer rather than to find one. There is a difference. An inquiry designed to find the truth proceeds from the evidence wherever it leads. An inquiry designed to provide an answer works backward from the politically necessary conclusion. The inquiry was conducted under the authority of an Admiralty Court and presided over by Justice Arthur Drysdale of the Nova Scotia Supreme Court. Judge Drysdale was, on the face of it, a reasonable choice for the role. He was an experienced jurist. He was familiar with maritime law. He knew Halifax. But what was not disclosed at the time was that Judge Drysdale had a personal connection to the disaster that should have, by any straightforward application of judicial ethics, disqualified him from presiding. His daughter had been injured in the explosion. He had a direct personal stake in seeing blame assigned. and he was the man whose job it was to assign it. The inquiry that Drysdale conducted was not, in the historical assessment of subsequent scholars and jurists who have examined the record, a fair proceeding. From the beginning, the pattern of questioning and the selection and weighting of evidence moved systematically in a specific direction, towards the crew of the Mont Blanc, toward Captain Lemedic and harbor pilot Francis Mackey. The political logic of this direction is not difficult to follow. The alternatives were worse. X for the government. If the inquiry concluded that the primary fault lay with the EMO, then the Charitable Commission for Relief in Belgium, which had chartered her, would bear significant liability. That was politically and humanistically unacceptable. If the inquiry concluded that the primary fault lay with the harbor management system, with the naval authorities who had allowed a ship loaded with 3,000 tons of explosives to anchor in a civilian harbor, without warning the civilians, then the Canadian government was exposed to liability that could, quite literally, have been financially catastrophic. The scale of the potential claims was enormous. Thousands of families had lost homes, possessions, family members, their ability to work and earn income. If those losses could be attributed to government negligence, the legal exposure was almost impossible to calculate. And beyond the financial question was the political question of what it would mean in the middle of a war in which the government was asking Canadians to make enormous sacrifices, to admit that the government itself had been responsible for killing nearly 2,000 of those Canadians through institutional negligence. The political cost was incalculable. Blaming the French captain was cleaner, contained the liability, provided a face for the grief and anger of the survivors to focus on, told a story that removed the question of systemic failure from the conversation, replacing it with the simpler and more emotionally satisfying story of individual error. Someone had done something wrong. Here he was. The system had not failed. A man had failed. The inquiry heard testimony from dozens of witnesses over several weeks. Sailors, dock workers, harbor officials, naval officers, maritime navigation experts, explosive specialists. The testimony, when read in its entirety, rather than through the selective summary that Drysdale's findings would present, was far more complicated than the eventual conclusion suggested. Multiple witnesses testified to the EMO being on the wrong side of the channel before the collision. Multiple witnesses described the exchange of whistle signals in ways that did not establish clear fault on the part of the Mont Blanc's navigation. The harbor control system's failures were documented in the testimony, but received a weighting in the final analysis that bore no relationship to their actual significance. And several witnesses testified specifically about the EMO's speed that morning. The harbor pilot William Hayes was dead, killed in the explosion, and so could not testify to his own conduct. But other witnesses, including people who had been on the water in the Narrows that morning, described the EMO as moving at a pace that was inconsistent with safe navigation in confined waters. This testimony was not ignored in Drysdale's proceedings. It was simply treated as less significant than the testimony about the Mont Blanc's navigation, without a clear stated reason for that differential treatment. A particular dimension of the inquiry involved the charge that Lemedic and Mackey had failed to properly warn the city of the danger as the Mont Blanc burned. The argument was that by abandoning ship without making more effective efforts to communicate the nature of the cargo, they had contributed to the civilian death toll. This argument, examined carefully, amounts to claiming that a French-speaking crew, in lifeboats rowing away from a ship they knew was about to explode, should have done a better job of warning an English-speaking waterfront population of the danger. The crew had been shouting warnings in French. The warnings had not been understood. The failure to communicate was a failure of the harbor's information architecture, not of the crew's effort. The charge that the Mont Blanc had failed to display warning flags indicating her dangerous cargo was equally revealing in what it concealed. The decision not to mark munition ships was not a decision made by Le Medec, and it was Allied military policy. It was the policy of the same government that was now prosecuting Le Medec for adhering to it. The argument was circular in a way that should have been obvious to any legally trained mind, examining it without a predetermined conclusion in view. Judge Drysdale delivered his findings in February of 1918. Captain Le Medec and pilot Francis Mackey were found primarily responsible for the collision and its consequences. Both men were charged with manslaughter. Both were charged with causing a public nuisance. The charges were serious. The potential penalties were severe. And the city of Halifax, still in the process of rebuilding, still counting its dead, had been provided with the narrative it needed. Someone was to blame. Someone would face justice. The case against Le Medec and Mackey proceeded through a preliminary inquiry before Magistrate Fracker, who found sufficient evidence to send both men to trial. Captain Fromm of the Emo was also initially charged, but the proceedings against him were treated with considerably less urgency and eventually did not proceed in the same manner. But the legal case was not as strong as the political process had made it appear. The lawyers representing Le Medec and Mackey began building an appeal. France, through its diplomatic channels, had an interest in the outcome and provided legal support for its national, Captain Le Medec. The appeal arguments challenged both the specific factual findings and the procedural conduct of the inquiry itself. The appeal review came before Justice Benjamin Russell of the Nova Scotia Supreme Court, and Russell was a very different kind of jurist than Arthur Drysdale. He approached the record of the inquiry without the same personal investment in its outcome. He read the testimony carefully, not through the filter of a predetermined conclusion. What he found troubled him. Russell concluded that the finding of primary blame against Le Medec and Mackey rested on a selective reading of the evidence that could not be sustained under rigorous legal analysis. The IMO's navigation had been found inadequate, and the tribunal's failure to weight this adequately was a flaw in the inquiry that could not be repaired after the fact. The charge related to the warning flags was, as the appeal arguments had demonstrated, an attempt to hold an individual responsible for following an institutional policy. The overall conduct of the inquiry reflected a rush to conclusion that was incompatible with the evidentiary standards of a criminal proceeding. In April of 1918, Justice Russell quashed the charges against Le Medec and Mackey. Both men were free. The manslaughter charges were gone. The public nuisance charges were gone. The legal case built by Drysdale's inquiry had been dismantled by a court that examined it. Honestly, this is the moment at which, in a more forthright society, the entire question of responsibility would have been reopened. The acquittal of the two men who had been charged said, implicitly, that the answer to the question of who was responsible had not been provided. The inquiry had failed to establish guilt. The real answer still had to be found. It was not found. What happened instead was silence. The acquittal was recorded. The government moved on. The harbor management system continued operating as before. No new inquiry was convened to examine the institutional failures. No investigation was launched into whether the system of routing explosive-laden ships through civilian harbors without warning those civilians needed to be changed. The acquittal of Le Medec and Mackey was treated not as the beginning of a harder conversation, but as the end of the matter entirely. Now, let us talk about what the government knew and when it knew it, because the most disturbing dimension of the Halifax story, the thing that moves it from tragedy into something closer to a crime, is the evidence that the conditions which allowed the explosion to happen were not a surprise. They were known. They had been identified and raised as concerns. and those concerns had been dismissed by the people with the authority to address them. Halifax Harbor in the wartime period was operating under what can only be described as a willful ignorance of basic safety principles. The decision to route enormous quantities of explosives through a harbor sitting in the middle of a civilian city, without establishing buffer zones, without mandatory evacuation protocols, without any system for warning the civilian population when unusually dangerous quantities of explosive material were present, was a considered policy choice. It was not an oversight born of ignorance. It was a choice made by people who understood the theoretical risk and decided that the operational requirements of the war outweighed it. In the months and years before the explosion, the individual harbor officials and naval officers had raised concerns about the density of shipping in the Narrows and the inadequate supervision of vessel movements. The examination system's inadequacy for the volume of traffic it was handling was documented in internal communications. More ships were moving through Halifax Harbor than the examination apparatus could properly process. This was known within the harbor administration. Recommendations to increase oversight, to add resources to the examination process, to establish stricter protocols for munitions ships had been made. They had not been acted on because acting on them would have slowed the movement of ships, and slowing the movement of ships was not acceptable. There is also the question of the specific hazard that the Mont Blanc represented. 3,000 tons of high explosives is not an ordinary munitions cargo. It was, even by wartime standards, an extreme load. The particular combination of materials aboard the Mont Blanc, specifically the interaction between the benzol on deck and the picric acid below, was understood by explosives experts to create a specific kind of hazard. The placement of the benzol drums on the exposed deck in a position where any collision or fire could ignite them before any corrective action was possible was a design that maximized the risk of exactly the kind of chain reaction that occurred. The authorities who approved the Mont Blanc's routing through Halifax had her cargo manifest. They knew she was carrying benzol on deck. They knew the benzol was separated from the explosive cargo below by only the deck of a 20-year-old ship. They approved her passage anyway. Someone made that decision. That person was not on trial in the Halifax inquiry. The financial dimension of the cover-up deserves specific attention. The Halifax Relief Commission was the mechanism through which the government managed both the genuine humanitarian crisis and the political crisis of potential liability. By establishing the commission as the primary vehicle for compensating survivors, the government effectively shifted the question from who was responsible to how much should be paid. The commission's mandate was to distribute aid. It was not to investigate responsibility. The creation of the commission was, among other things, a way of separating the humanitarian response from the accountability question, making it easier to do the former without addressing the latter. The commission's assets were substantial, as noted, but the way those assets were dispersed reflects the same hierarchy of worth that had shaped the original disaster. The residents of Richmond who had owned property received one level of compensation. The residents who had rented received less. The workers who had been injured and could no longer work received modest disability pensions. The Mi'kmaq survivors of Turtle Grove received compensation through a separate channel, the Indian Affairs bureaucracy, which processed their claims with the same combination of paternalism and delay that characterized its dealings with Indigenous communities everywhere in Canada. The Mi'kmaq experience of the Halifax explosion is, from a historical justice perspective, the most complete piece of the cover-up, and it was accomplished not through active suppression, but through the simple absence of any effort to document, record, or memorialize the Mi'kmaq losses in any meaningful way. The official histories of the explosion, written in the decades after the event, focused almost exclusively on the white working-class residents of Richmond. The Mi'kmaq community of Turtle Grove appeared in those histories, when it appeared at all, as a footnote. Their dead were not counted in the official totals with the same rigor. Their names were not carved into the same memorials. Their stories were not collected with the same urgency. The practical consequence of this erasure was that the Mi'kmaq community at Turtle Grove received less aid, less attention, and less acknowledgement than any other group of survivors. The community, which had already been economically marginal before the explosion, was left to rebuild with minimal government support in a context where even the white survivors of Richmond were receiving inadequate assistance. It took the better part of a century for the Mi'kmaq experience of the Halifax Explosion to receive serious scholarly and public attention. The work of researchers who began in the 1990s and 2000s to reconstruct the story of Turtle Grove in collaboration with Mi'kmaq community members has produced a partial record of what happened there on December 6, 1917. Partial because so much of the record was never created in the first place. You cannot recover an archive that was never built. The Halifax Relief Commission eventually wound down over several decades, and its operations continuing well into the mid-20th century as the last surviving dependents of explosion victims aged out of their pensions. The final accounts of its operations were, when examined by researchers, a document of institutional mediocrity in the service of a genuinely important need. The commission did real good. It also failed in real ways. The failure was not simply bureaucratic inefficiency. It reflected the same set of priorities that had shaped the whole government response to the disaster: the interest in limiting liability, managing political fallout, and maintaining the narrative that the explosion had been an accident, rather than the foreseeable consequence of a negligent system. Let us now talk about the long-term aftermath and what it means. The city of Halifax rebuilt. The reconstruction of the Richmond neighborhood happened in the years immediately following the explosion, driven partly by the Halifax Relief Commission's funding and partly by the ordinary human drive to restore what had been lost. The new Richmond was, by the assessment of urban historians, a somewhat better planned and better built neighborhood than what it replaced, if also a neighborhood that carried no visible trace of what had stood there before. The topography remained the same. The streets followed roughly the same lines. But the people who had built the original Richmond over generations, the families whose names and histories were embedded in its streets and houses, were largely gone. The memorialization of the explosion was, for most of the 20th century, curiously muted. For a disaster of such scale, the public remembrance seemed to occupy less cultural space than the event deserved. There are several reasons for this. One is the immediate superimposition of the armistice and the end of the First World War in November of 1918, less than a year after the explosion. The end of the war brought a relief so profound that it overwhelmed other narratives. The country turned away from its wartime traumas and toward peace, and the Halifax explosion was folded into a larger story of wartime sacrifice that did not encourage close examination of any specific disaster. Another reason is the one that has run through this entire documentary. The official narrative, established by the Drysdale Inquiry and never formally replaced after its findings were overturned, had done its work. The story that had settled into the public consciousness was the story of an accident. Two ships colliding, a fire that couldn't be stopped, a terrible, inevitable tragedy. The harder questions that a different inquiry might have raised, questions about the management of the harbor, about the routing of munitions through civilian areas, about who was responsible for the decisions that had put 3,000 tons of explosives in range of a densely populated neighborhood. Those questions had been foreclosed before they were asked. The Fort Needham Memorial Park, built on one of the areas hardest hit by the explosion on the northern slope of the Halifax Peninsula, was not completed until 1985. Nearly 70 years passed between the explosion and the construction of a formal memorial to its victims. The Carillon Bell Tower at the park rings every December 6th, and the service held there each year draws a community that has maintained the memory of the disaster across generations. But the park is modest relative to the scale of what it commemorates, and its construction came late. The serious scholarly reassessment of the explosion, beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, brought new and uncomfortable dimensions of the story to light. Historians working with the original archival records found the same pattern of omission and redirection in the official record that this documentary has been tracing. The more carefully the documents were examined, the more clearly visible became the shape of what had been managed away from public view. Janet Kitts, whose research began with the collection of survivor testimony in the 1970s and culminated in her foundational book, On the Disaster Shattered City, documented for the first time the full extent of the human cost and the full range of the survivors' experiences. Her work gave back to the victims of the Halifax explosion the individuality and specificity that the official record had stripped from them by converting them into statistics. The survivors she interviewed in their old age were, for many of them, talking about December 6th, 1917 for the first time publicly. The experience had been kept within families, within communities, because there had never been a public forum in which it was invited. The science of the explosion has been thoroughly reconstructed. The physics of the pressure wave, the trajectory of the debris field, the chemistry of the 3,000-ton cargo detonation, all of these have been analyzed in detail by researchers using the tools of modern forensic engineering and chemistry. The reconstruction confirms what was suspected. The explosion was the largest man-made detonation in history to that point, and it was located, by the operational decisions of the harbor management system, as close to a concentrated civilian population as it was physically possible to be. The understanding of what we now know about the Halifax explosion, the full picture that includes the institutional failures and the political maneuvering and the Mi'kmaq erasure and the inadequate compensation, has not been translated into formal acknowledgement by the Canadian government. There has been no official apology for the harbor management failures. There has been no formal statement acknowledging the inadequacy of the treatment of Mi'kmaq survivors. The compensation for those failures, insofar as any has been provided, has come in the form of scholarly attention and public memory, rather than official accountability. This is, in one sense, not surprising. The people responsible for the decisions that led to the Halifax explosion have been dead for generations. The institutions that failed are still operating, transformed in structure but continuous in identity. The political cost of formal acknowledgement is low in absolute terms because the events are so far in the past. But the symbolic importance of formal acknowledgement to the descendants of the people who were killed and displaced and inadequately compensated is not nothing. It is the difference between a government that says, in effect, our predecessors made mistakes that cost lives, and we acknowledge that, and a government that says nothing because saying nothing is easier. The Halifax explosion belongs to the category of disasters that are simultaneously historical events and ongoing arguments. Arguments about how industrial and military activity should be managed in proximity to civilian populations. Arguments about who bears the cost when that management fails. Arguments about the integrity of official inquiry when institutional self-interest is at stake. Arguments about whose lives are counted and whose are footnoted. These arguments are not academic. They are rerun in every era in different forms. The specific mechanics of the Halifax explosion, the munition ships, the harbor pilots, the examination vessels, belong to 1917. But the underlying dynamics, the institutional prioritization of efficiency over safety, the management of disaster narratives to protect the powerful at the expense of the accountable truth, the differential treatment of marginalized communities in the distribution of relief and recognition are not historical. They are contemporary. They are happening somewhere right now, in some harbor, in some city, in some official inquiry whose predetermined conclusion is already being drafted before the evidence has been heard. Vince Coleman knew none of this. He sat at his telegraph key on the morning of December 6th, 1917, and he sent a warning that was honest and complete and accurate, and that saved hundreds of people who would otherwise have been killed. He did not do it because he had analyzed the institutional failures of Halifax Harbor. He did it because the train was coming and the warning had to be sent. It was that simple. It was always that simple. The people who died in Richmond that morning did not die because of fate or because of unavoidable accident. They died because of choices. Choices about how to run a harbor. Choices about how much risk was acceptable for people who were not asked whether they accepted it. Choices about who to blame when those risks became catastrophes. Choices about who to help and how much, and who to leave out. Those choices had names attached to them. The names are in the archives. Some of them are known. None of them faced the consequences that the almost 2,000 people who died in Halifax on December 6th, 1917, faced for being in the wrong place when a system of deliberate negligence finally broke down. That is what was buried. And that is what we owe it to the dead to remember. Let us take some time with the survivors themselves, because the history of the Halifax explosion has a tendency to move past them too quickly, rushing from the event to the inquiry to the verdict without pausing long enough on the people whose lives were permanently reshaped by what happened in the Narrows on a Thursday morning in December. The survivors of the Halifax explosion lived, as a population, with a particular kind of invisible wound. The explosion was not a war. It was not something that the society around them was configured to process as collective trauma. There were no medals, no veteran services, no cultural apparatus for acknowledging what the survivors had been through. They had been in a city that had been destroyed, and then the city had been rebuilt, and life had resumed, and the expectation was that they would resume with it. Many did, in the external sense. They rebuilt their lives. They raised children, they worked. Some of them rarely spoke about December 6th at all for decades. But the researchers who began interviewing surviving witnesses in the 1970s found, almost universally, that the explosion lived just below the surface in all of them. Older men and women who had been children on December 6th, 1917, could recall the details of that morning with a vividness and precision that indicated they had spent decades involuntarily replaying it. The smell of burning, the specific quality of the pressure that had preceded the blast wave, the strange atmospheric sensation that several survivors described as a kind of sucking sensation, a second before the glass exploded inward. The silence. Multiple survivors described a profound silence in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, before the sounds of screaming and fire and collapse began. A silence that seemed wrong, that seemed to indicate something had been taken out of the world. The children who had been blinded grew up and built lives, many of them. The Halifax School for the Blind, which had been struggling to accommodate the sudden influx of new students in the months after the explosion, eventually became an institution that trained many of its students for productive adult lives. The men and women who had lost their sight as children on December 6th became, in many cases, teachers, musicians, crafts people, business people. The specific nature of their blindness caused by glass rather than disease, was in many cases total and irreversible. But the capacity for a full and meaningful human life was not destroyed along with their sight. What did persist across the community of survivors as a whole was a particular relationship with December. People who had lived through the Halifax Explosion described, in the interviews conducted with them in their later years, a consistent pattern in how the approach of December affected them. The shortening of the days, the cooling of the air, the quality of the light in late November, all of it functioned as a kind of involuntary memorial. The body remembered December 6th, even when the mind tried to set it aside. Some survivors found that they could not be in certain parts of the city in early December without a physical response that went beyond ordinary grief. The smell of a harbor, the sound of a ship's whistle in the morning, the sight of smoke rising from a vessel in the water, these things could reach back across decades and produce a visceral, immediate response that the survivors could not always explain to people who had not been there. The community of survivors maintained itself for decades through informal networks of mutual recognition. People who had been in Richmond that morning or who had lost family members there formed a social category that was real and significant even when it was never formally named. They found each other in churches, in communities or organizations, in the schools their children attended. The shared experience bound them together in ways that did not require explanation between them and could not be fully explained to anyone outside it. The last public survivor of the Halifax Explosion who had direct memories of the morning of December 6th was Dorothy Chisholm, who died in 2009 at the age of 98. She had been 7 years old when the explosion happened. She had been in the kitchen of her family's home when the blast wave hit. She survived, and she spent the next century as one of the living connections between 1917 and the present. In interviews in her final years, she described the explosion itself with the same clarity that characterized every survivor's account of it. The sound, which was not what you would expect, the feeling of the pressure, the sudden change in the world outside the window, and then the rest of it, which she carried for 92 years, more than most people ever thought possible to carry. It's for those whose injuries had been physical rather than sensory, the path was often harder in the long term. The burns that many survivors had suffered were, in the medical knowledge of 1917, treated with what was available, which was not always what was needed. Scar tissue and chronic pain became permanent features of many survivors' lives. The long-term respiratory effects of having inhaled the toxic smoke from the burning cargo were not well understood and were therefore not well treated. Men and women who had seemed to recover adequately from their immediate injuries found in subsequent years that their health was more fragile than it should have been, that they were more susceptible to respiratory illness, that they tired more easily than people of their age and background expected to. And the Halifax Relief Commission's pension system was supposed to address these long-term effects. In practice, it was designed more around documented immediate losses, property, income, specific demonstrable injury, than around the harder-to-measure cumulative effects of having been in a catastrophic explosion. As the years passed and the connection between the explosion and specific health problems became more attenuated and harder to establish in the legal and medical terms the Commission required, the number of people receiving any compensation declined. By the 1940s, the Commission's active caseload had been substantially reduced, though its operations continued in a reduced form for decades longer. One of the most revealing aspects of the survivor experience is what happened to the people who had lost family members, but no property and no demonstrable permanent injury. A man who had been at work when the explosion hit and came home to find his wife and children dead, but whose workplace was intact and who was not himself injured, was in a genuinely terrible position. relative to the Commission's categories. His losses were real and devastating. They were also largely invisible in the actuarial framework the Commission used to assess and disperse compensation. The grief and the psychological impact of what he had lost were not categories that the Commission was equipped to address. He was not a widow. He was not disabled. His house, if he had been far enough from Richmond, might not even have been damaged. He simply had no family anymore, and a Commission that did not know what to do with him. This kind of loss, the loss of people rather than property, was the hardest for the official system to accommodate. It was also, in the Richmond neighborhood, where entire families had been killed, the most common kind of loss. The Halifax explosion was not primarily a property disaster, it was primarily a people disaster, and the systems that were designed to respond to it, the inquiry, the commission, the legal framework for assigning blame and distributing compensation, were all systems designed by and for a society that was more comfortable measuring the value of property than the value of people. Now let us look more carefully at something that has been threaded through this entire story, but deserves its own sustained attention. The question of why Halifax Harbor was as dangerous as it was in 1917 is inseparable from the question of what the British and Canadian governments believed about the acceptable risk to civilian populations in wartime. The British experience of managing munitions in the context of the First World War included several catastrophic explosions before December of 1917. The Silvertown explosion in January of 1917, just months before the Halifax disaster, had killed 73 people and injured more than 400 when a munitions factory in East London exploded. The Faversham explosion in 1916 had killed more than 100 workers at a gunpowder factory. The explosion at Arklow in Ireland in 1917 had killed 27 people. These disasters were not secret. They were widely reported. The British government knew, from direct experience, what happened when large quantities of explosive material went wrong in proximity to civilian populations. But each of these earlier disasters had involved either deliberate military or industrial settings, factories and storage facilities, rather than ships in civilian harbors. The specific hazard of routing explosives, laden ships through civilian ports, anchoring them within range of populated neighborhoods, moving them through narrow channels crowded with other vessels, had not been the subject of the same regulatory attention that factory safety had received, even in the limited form that factory safety regulation took in 1917. There was a legal and regulatory framework for the management of dangerous goods in factories and some land-based storage facilities. There was not an equivalent framework for the management of dangerous goods aboard ships in civilian harbors. Maritime regulations existed, but they were focused primarily on navigation and the prevention of collision and fire at sea, not on the management of risk to shore-based civilian populations. The Halifax explosion should have been the catalyst for the development of such a framework. It demonstrated with terrible clarity that a ship carrying 3,000 tons of explosives in a civilian harbor was a fundamentally different kind of hazard than a ship carrying 3,000 tons of grain or timber. It demonstrated that the absence of protocols for warning shore-based populations of the risk created by dangerous cargoes was not a theoretical gap, but a lethal one. It demonstrated that the examination system, designed for security rather than safety, was incapable of functioning as a safety mechanism for civilians without fundamental restructuring. None of this restructuring happened in 1917 or 1918. The political process that should have driven it, the inquiry, had been designed to prevent exactly this conclusion from being reached. The Drysdale inquiry had served its purpose by directing attention toward the individual, navigational decisions of Lemaitre and Mackey, and away from the systemic questions that would have required systemic answers. By the time the charges against both men were dropped and the systemic questions were reopened by default, the war was nearly over. The urgency that might have driven reform had dissipated. The political attention had moved on. The port safety regulations that now govern the movement of dangerous goods through civilian harbors in Canada and in most developed countries are substantially more rigorous than what existed in 1917. They require detailed tracking of hazardous cargoes, specific notification protocols, separation of dangerous vessels from high-traffic areas, mandatory reporting requirements, and mechanisms for communicating risk to shore-based authorities. These regulations exist because of disasters like Halifax, disasters that demonstrated the cost of not having them, but they developed slowly and piecemeal over several decades, driven by each new accident rather than by the proactive application of the lessons of the previous one. The Halifax explosion sits at the beginning of a long chain of industrial disasters, each of which produced some measure of regulatory reform, each of which was partly produced by the failure to apply the lessons of the last one. That chain is not broken, it continues. The specific form of negligence that created the conditions for the Halifax explosion, the institutional prioritization of operational efficiency over civilian safety, the management of disaster narratives to protect institutional interests, the differential treatment of marginalized communities in both the creation of hazards and the distribution of relief continues to manifest in different industries and different contexts in every era. The reason we should know this history is not to feel satisfied that the past was bad. We knew that. It is to recognize the specific patterns by which institutional systems convert the well-being of ordinary people into an acceptable cost, and to understand that those patterns are not defeated by good intentions alone. They require active resistance, the kind of active resistance that Vince Coleman demonstrated when he chose not to run, the kind of active resistance that the lawyers who appealed Drysdale's findings demonstrated when they refused to accept a predetermined conclusion, the kind of active resistance that the historians who have spent decades recovering the Mi'kmaq community's experience of the disaster have demonstrated in their patient, careful work against the easier narrative. The Halifax explosion happened in 6 seconds. What made it happen took years. What followed it, the cover-up, the management of responsibility, the inadequate compensation, the erasure of the Mi'kmaq experience took decades. And understanding the full scope of what happened requires seeing all three timelines together, not just the most dramatic one. There is one more thing to say about what happened in Halifax after the explosion and the inquiry and the acquittal and the rebuilding. Halifax continued to be a major port. The harbor continued to operate. Ships continued to move through the Narrows, and for many years the people who lived in the rebuilt Richmond neighborhood, the children of families who had rebuilt there, could look out from the same heights toward the same Narrows and watch the same kinds of ships moving through the same channel. Whether those ships were carrying anything dangerous, whether the harbor management system had been improved enough to actually protect them if something went wrong, were questions that the official history of the Halifax explosion had been very carefully designed to make it seem unnecessary to ask. The answer to those questions worked out over subsequent decades in the development of maritime safety law and port management regulation was that the harbor eventually did become safer, not because of what happened in Halifax in 1917, but because the accumulation of subsequent disasters, each producing its own partial reform, eventually built a regulatory structure that addressed some of the most serious gaps. The Richmond neighborhood exists today. Families live in it. Children go to school there. In early December, in the weeks before Christmas, and some of those families go to Fort Needham and stand at the Carillon Tower and listen to the bells ring for the people who died there on December 6th, 1917. The bells ring across the Narrows and over the harbor, and out toward the open Atlantic. They are rung by people who were not there, for people who were, for a morning that ended a city and began a cover-up and has never been fully reckoned with by the institutions that had the most to answer for. Vince Coleman sent his last message and stayed at his key and died at his post. The train was stopped. The passengers lived. The city was destroyed anyway, and the government, whose harbor had made it possible, found 2 men to charge, a court to convict them, and, when that court was overturned, moved on to the next problem. That is the truth of what happened in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on December 6th, 1917. That is the truth that was buried, and it deserves to be known. If this story raised questions you want to explore further, the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax maintains one of the most comprehensive public archives on the explosion and its aftermath. The work of historian Janet Kitts, particularly her book Shattered City, is the most thorough single-volume account of the disaster and its human cost. For those interested in the Mi'kmaq community's experience, researchers working with Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia continue to recover a history that was far too long invisible. And for those who want to understand how systemic failures become disasters, the Halifax Explosion is one of the clearest case studies in recorded history. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We will keep digging.